Thank you, Simon, and thank you for having me here. It's fantastic to be at a place like Grantham. There are many places in the world where you walk in as a climate economist and people don't mistake you for a living, walking oxymoron. Mm-hmm. Sort of, right, like pick your battle, pick your sides, right? It's either climate or the economy. Or I guess worse, essentially, right, sort of they look at climate and it's like, well, one of these issues, and then the economy, you've been getting it wrong for forever on that one too. So why would I listen to someone who does both? So yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Now, I should also give you a warning on a different dimension. Right, this old joke that if you are the smartest person in a room, you better find a different room. So suffice it to say, it is not necessary for me to storm out here. There's plenty of you who do very, very interesting, very, very exciting work on the climate change dimension, economics of climate change, the whole lot. What I will try to do is try to talk about the kinds of equations that all of us like to put on blackboards, whiteboards, what have you, without essentially mentioning a single equation. Or for that matter, doing much of anything other than showing you pretty pictures. This happens to be two of my babies. My 1-year-old isn't on there. This is my 4-year-old when he was a baby, and my other baby, the book. But whenever there's a slide with a number on it, it's going to be something like this. And this is probably already one of the more important numbers we could all try to memorize by heart. Now, not necessarily $40 per se, right? It's, I think, 26.5 pounds. 25 pounds for lack of to avoid false precision here. Now, what is this figure? Right? It is essentially the result of 12 US government agencies running something like 3 models under the leadership of Mr. Benefit Cost Analysis, at least Mr. US Benefit Cost Analysis himself. And they came up with $40. $40 per ton of CO2, 25 pounds per ton of CO2 at essentially what the US government calls the central value of its estimate of the cost that each ton of CO2 emitted causes today. Now, that's in many ways the starting point. And there is a book I can show you and point you to that essentially argues why this, if anything, is the absolute lower bound of what we ought to be thinking about. And if you look at it in a different way, is both falsely precise, falsely accurate, and in fact, in many ways, the wrong value to rally around. Now, that said, of course, right, if you show up in Washington, let's say, or any government office anywhere, and someone puts a gun to your head and essentially says, okay, give me the number, give me a number, I want to pass, do something sensible on climate policy, which I guess that statement by itself should already make us, sit up and try to be as helpful as we can humanly be to whoever is asking that question. We could do a lot worse than plug in $40. Frankly, the alternative in many scenarios in the US at least is to put in a big fat zero, which in and of itself, of course, is not just falsely precise, but blatantly wrong. But we do tend to do that too, more often than not. But $40, right, we can do a lot worse than think of this as, at the very least, is these 25 pounds, $40, to think of as the cost each ton of CO2 emissions, right? I flew here from Boston to Heathrow. Well, 1 ton of CO2, $40, right there. Now, of course, I did not pay for those $40. All of us ended up paying a fraction of a penny because me taking that flight, which of course is precisely the problem. And we'll return to that in due course. But for now, let me expand this by another number to keep in mind for the rest of this conversation, or a range of numbers, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. Now, I trust that many of you here would in fact know what that is. Climate scientists call it climate sensitivity. What happens to temperatures eventually as concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere double? And suffice it to say, that number has been around for a while. Jules Charney, 1979, National Academy Commission, was literally the back of a napkin, back of an envelope, where he essentially forced to come up with a number. Okay, so how bad is this climate change thing in the end? Well, it turns out there were two models around at the time. One said it was 2 degrees. Global average temperatures would eventually increase by 2 degrees centigrade with a doubling of CO2 concentrations. The other model said it was 4 degrees. As any proper scientist would too, he just took the two, made it a range, added 0.5 on either end because there's uncertainty, after all. And that was the number, 1979. Enshrined IPCC, 1990, 20 years later, 11 years later, still the exact same range. 1992, 1995, 2001. Right? Amazing advances in climate science every step along the way. And frankly, the central estimate, or what many would call the central estimate, what happens to temperatures as we pump more CO2 into the atmosphere, that range stayed exactly the same. Now, our assuredness of that being the exact range, that being the right range, in fact increased, and somewhere along the way the IPCC defined a proper definition of what it means to have a likely range. It was defined as the 66% probability of being within that range. Not 67, not 2/3, 66. So yes, we were more sure of being within that range, but nevertheless the range didn't budge. Now, big revelation. The IPCC's fourth assessment report, 2007, in many ways bad news, right? Good news for science. We now have a better handle of what climate change actually does to temperatures, what pumping CO2 into the atmosphere does to temperatures. Now, of course, bad news because it looks like it'll be worse than we originally thought. There's still a range. Of course, the uncertainty matters, but at the very least, we now know we can narrow the range ever so slightly. All right, so good news for science, bad news for the rest of us. That was 2007. Fast forward to October 2013. Once again, right, 800 scientists, plus minus a couple hundred, writing, once again, yet another huge assessment report, IPCC Assessment Report 5, Working Group 1, the climate scientists, not us economists, the climate scientists, trying to figure out what actually happens when you pump CO2 into the atmosphere. Well, fast forward from 2007 to 2013, and we have apparently unlearned. Now, of course, we haven't really. What we have done is we've looked at new information, and we've figured out that, well, looks like uncertainty is in fact larger than we had thought in only 2007. And yeah, we are back to where we started in 1979. Okay, so what does that mean? Now there's several tacks we can take here and basically say, well, sort of on the lower end, things may well turn out all right. Well, bzzzt, wrong interpretation. Right? So this is what happens due to a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. Unless we act dramatically and fast, we will surely double concentrations. We started at 280 parts per million of CO2. By now we've passed 400. We will surely get to 560, a doubling, in the next 2 or 3 decades, unless we change course, right? There's always the unless we change course, right? Why in the world would you want to venture a prediction if all you do is wait for that prediction to actually become true, right? So there's always the unless you change course dimension to all of this. And of course, 1.5 degrees global average warming due to a doubling, and yes, we will get there unless we change course. There's plenty of nasty side effects, right? Now, I'm not the climate scientist who will now go into the laundry list of things that could or potentially would happen. Let me just say that last time we were at concentrations of 400 ppm. Pliocene was the geological clock. we had camels living in the Arctic Circle, crocodiles living in the Arctic Circle for that matter, and sea levels were up to 66 feet, 20 meters higher than they are today. Right? Now, no one is in fact predicting that that is what we can expect just given current conditions, or for that matter, even a doubling of CO2 or sort of going, keep going the path we are going, right? No one is really saying 20 meters of sea level rise. Now, that might be a bit of a reassurance on the one hand. Really what it should tell us is that there's a lot more uncertainty built into this than even the best climate scientists, anyone, would currently, in some sense, admit to, or consider even in the best of climate models. Right? Given that no one is predicting the conditions that happened last time we had 400 ppm, 400 parts per million of CO2, and we are there today already, basically means that uncertainty is in fact something that we ought to be taking seriously. The fact that we don't know whether we are 1.5 or 4.5 is a big, big problem. It is even a bigger problem once we consider what all of this actually means. Well, if the IPCC says there is a 66% chance of being within that range, right, roughly 2/3 chance, well, there's roughly a 2/3 chance of being outside it. Now, in official climate scientist lingo, it is in fact unlikely that we are outside that range, because the 66 is defined as a likely range. Nevertheless, unlikely still comes with a 34% probability. Right? There's a third chance that we won't be in that range. And then, I can tell you this is only one of only 3 graphs in the entire book. You'll see all 3 now in rapid succession. But when you look at what that implies, that, well, the lower tail, we can in fact cut that off. Right? No one would reasonably say that increasing CO2 would decrease temperature, so we can cut things off at 0. We can't do the same at the upper limit. Or in other words, we are looking at something like a 10% chance, given the path we are on, of global average temperatures, in fact, exceeding 6 degrees centigrade on average. Now, right, that's sort of the average global number. Well, lots of implications here. On the one hand, poles tend to warm, at least have warmed, at 3 times the rate as the average. Right? Bad news for your beachfront property, on the one hand. On the other, of course, right, no one really knows. No one can say for sure what happens at 4 degrees or 5 degrees, let alone what happens at 6 degrees centigrade of global average warming. We just don't know. Right? Mark Linus wrote the book 6 Degrees, right? Final chapter ended with 6 degrees, and that chapter began with a reference to Dante's Inferno, Sixth Circle of Hell. And not because sort of it's a flippant account of what is going on, right? If you go through the climate science literature and figure out what is in fact happening at 6 degrees of average global warming, many would just throw their hands in the air. Now, no one would say, okay, well, it may just not be all that bad. It'll be seriously damaging to all of us. The only question is how bad it'll actually be. That's the shock part in climate shock, if you will. We just don't know. The problem is the uncertainty only goes in one dimension. Here's the one table from the book, or one of 2 tables technically. All right, so what does this in fact mean when you dive into the real probabilities here? Well, what everyone focuses is what is usually loosely described as the average. In the copious endnotes, not in the main text, I can assure you, but in the copious endnotes, we define that in our calibration exercise here as the median temperature increase of global average, global median warming around the globe. Well, and where would we get to? Well, we are already past the 400 ppm, 400 parts per million of CO2. Well, actually, we're well past 400 ppm when it comes to CO2 equivalent emissions. We're already at 450 and beyond. So we would expect something like average global warming, median global warming, of 2 degrees centigrade, which is sort of roughly the political goal of we ought to limit warming at that level. And then you look, okay, what happens based on a fairly ambitious, positive scenario, as it were. Let's look at the International Energy Agency's new policy scenario. So that's already assuming lots of new policies, in fact, coming into place. Or in other words, for us, it is a lowercase conservative interpretation in essentially saying, well, we're certainly not looking at the worst of the worst here. We're already assuming that lots and lots of things will happen on the positive front when it comes to policies put in place. But still, we are focused on the average here. And then you look at 700 parts per million, what the IEA here predicts we will get to by 2100, by the end of the century. And you get to average global warming of 3.4 degrees centigrade, right? Roughly 3 to 3.5 degrees centigrade. Now, when I say sort of roughly hand-waving, well, of course, the difference here matters, and it matters a lot. On the other hand, when you look at the top row, which, by the way, everybody is looking at, everyone else is looking at, you look at basically fairly small, significant, as climate scientists would assure you, but still relatively small increases in global average warming as concentrations keep rising. Let's say we go from 1.8 to 2.5, let's say, a change of 1.5 times. Now, look what happens in the bottom row. That is the probability of exceeding what can only be interpreted as a true climate catastrophe. If you haven't passed it along the way, then there's no way to believe that 6 degrees centigrade of average global warming is just sort of, yeah, that'll be fine. We move New York City and London and a couple cities, but the rest will be fine. No, it won't. And yes, moving London by itself may already be just ever so slightly costly. But when you look at this, you see the probability increasing here from something very, very close to zero at today's levels, or 0.3% actually at today's levels of CO2 equivalent emissions of all greenhouse gases, by a factor of 10, increasing to 3%, whereas average global warming only increased by a factor of 1.5. Or in other words, if you focus on one thing, one number, don't focus on the average, focus on the extremes. Right, it's not over till the fat tail zings. That's what the money is. That's what a cost is. That's what we ought to focus on. Or, of course, then when you go all the way up to, once again, a relatively conservative assumption of where we will end up by 2100 unless we act, you will get to something greater than a 10% chance of a scenario that can only be described as catastrophic. Right? Which, of course, is precisely then where you would flip things around and say, climate change really is an insurance problem. It's not about the averages. They are bad enough, of course, and just in a rational world, we would have long acted based on average predictions. Now, if that doesn't convince you, look at the bottom line in terms of the true catastrophe, planetary catastrophe, whatever you want to call it. There's only so many terms you can use without being accused of catastrophizing. But there's no way to overstate the significance of something akin to a 10% chance of exceeding 6 degrees average global warming. Okay, now, what does that mean? Right? How do you interpret that in English, as it were? Now, in order to do that, right, we need to do one more thing here. No one cares about temperatures. We care about the damages caused by temperatures. And then, of course, you need to make yet another set of assumptions. How do you translate temperatures into actual monetary damages? And then you look at basically the assumptions that we've had now for the better part of, well, certainly this century, but basically for about 30 years at this point. We've focused on a few models, 3 of them to be precise, that also feed into this $40 number, that all make very simple, tractable, technical term, assumptions of how you translate these damages into, how do you translate these temperature increases into damages. And what you come out with is, well, you need to assume some kind of functional form. What happens at particular temperature increases, global average temperature increases. What happens in terms of economic output, let's say, simple way of graphing these things. And the assumption, usually, is what you see at the bottom line, this dotted blue line. Right? No one believes these damages increase linearly or just slowly creep up. There's certainly some kind of increased damages based on an increase in temperatures here, and that increase is increasing. But of course, when you make this assumption on the bottom line, that increase is very, very small. Now, we are not saying that it ought to be the red line instead. It ought to increase exponentially instead. Simply what we are saying is we actually don't know, and no one else does either. And when we are honest about not knowing, the uncertainty, of course, matters a lot. Or in other words, if you think that you'll be at 3 degrees, the difference doesn't matter all that much. If you think that there's a chance that you'll be at 6 degrees, the difference matters a lot. And frankly, drives everything else that you can potentially do here. Right? Thus concludes the graph. So what is the implication of this? Well, $40 is in fact the lower bound of what you could possibly imagine. Now, right now we can talk all day long about what should the precise number be. And in many ways, I would say any of this conversation would be false precision because, of course, where we are on average is at negative 10 pounds, negative $15. When you look at $500 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies globally, averaged over how much CO2 we emit, you end up with minus $15. Right? Now, there are, of course, noble exceptions. Not every country is subsidizing at exactly that same rate, and hence to be concentrated in countries that can afford those subsidies, i.e. the ones that own a lot of oil, and hence burn a lot. Still, on average, globally, minus 15 bucks. All right, so at the very least, let's get back to the 40. Those 26.5 pounds to mention the falsely precise number here. Okay, what to do? Well, here's what not to do. And I don't mean either having kids or flying. Actually, let's get a different picture. This was my son when he was, my now 4-year-old son when he was 3 weeks visiting his grandparents. And yes, he was wearing a small carbon footprint hat, of course, for good measure. He's been to Austria now from New York or Cambridge 6, 8 times or so he gets around. Certainly no longer a small carbon footprint. That was me, not coming over here, but flying to a UN-sponsored climate meeting. Now, thank you, BA, for the free upgrade. That's a fruit basket, that's a glass of wine. I still have the first class kit. It's a nice little toothbrush. It's fantastic. The eye cover is very, very nice. I still now, okay, this is my laptop, of course. I still own that laptop, I can tell you. I was writing a paper, Funding the Turn to Climate Safety, sitting in first class at BA. Now, of course, you can look at this picture and sort of have the immediate reaction, of course, okay, serious? There's the EDF, Environmental Defense Fund logo on the top left. And you're stretching out with 1, 2, 3 windows at my disposal. It was a great flight. London, Bangkok, it was lovely. Sorry, getting distracted here. But okay, so here's what not to do, right? Which is essentially to then say, okay, well, if you look at, let's say, flying, well, we just ought to all voluntarily decline the free upgrade. Clearly, my CO2 emissions were a lot higher flying first class than they were economy class. Or for that matter, just not fly at all. Because the 1 ton of CO2 coming over here, this time around, given that I was sitting in row 44 or 45 or so, only half a window at my disposal. That's not the answer. Or in other words, banning flights, for example, is not the answer. Now here's also what's not the answer. Right? This is a full-page ad taken out by Patagonia, the company, saying, the color version had a blue fleece jacket here. Don't buy this jacket. Now, I did a little experiment. I walked into the Patagonia store on the Upper West Side in Manhattan the day after this ad appeared. Turns out they were sold out. So yes, advertisement works. Now, it also, of course, shows why voluntary action doesn't work. Right? Now, Patagonia, frankly, appeals to exactly us here, right? First of all, the people who know where Patagonia is, not just the store, but the area, right? The region in Argentina. Right, and we all, right, you'll read this text, and yes, this is a fantastically made jacket out of recycled whatever, and my wife owns 2 of them, I can tell you. It is a great jacket. Now, of course, they tell you not to buy the jacket, knowing very well that that's not really the goal, right? If businesses advertising themselves out of existence can't be the solution to climate change. If anything, we have to make it profitable for businesses to be doing the right thing, be decreasing emissions, not just me voluntarily planting a bunch of trees to make up for the carbon emissions that my flight will have caused, but to, in fact, make sure that everyone pays for the damage their flights are causing, right? Or in other words, it is clearly policy, it is not voluntary action. It's right, what us environmentalists, when I put on my environmentalist hat, oftentimes believe. Now, of course, right, no one at Grantham here would, in fact, mistake that for the true solution. Nevertheless, right, as an environmentalist, I'm embarrassed to say in many ways that there's plenty of us who say, well, at the end of the day, it's more things like this. And I'm not saying Patagonia isn't trying to do the right thing, but of course they're doing the right thing, or quote unquote, trying to do the right thing within the very limited choice set we are giving them. Right? In many ways, I don't want them to advertise themselves out of business because they are in fact doing many of the right things. It is a recycled fleece jacket. It is actually more climate, more positive for the climate, less costly in terms of CO2 emissions, or less costly in water emissions, right, with their reduce, repair, reuse, recycle slogan here, than, frankly, anyone else producing jackets. Still, that can't be the answer, either on the individual level, right, me refusing this water bottle and choosing this instead, and of course what I do is I pour the water into, make sure that I demonstrate that I'm using my recycled water bottle. Or for that matter, a company saying, like, don't buy our product, knowing very well that the thing will be sold out the next day. Now, one more quick story after I blow my nose. Here's a very relevant question. And frankly, not to me, right? I'm a good environmentalist. I don't even have a driver's license. So I would never dream of doing this, right? I not just use this. We don't have a, we didn't have a baby carriage for the longest time. We carried the kid around somehow thinking that it was better for the planet. Anyway, I'm vegetarian. I don't have a driver's license. Right? So all these sorts of things, right? You can sort of go to extremes. Which is, of course, fine if you live in New York, not that fine if you live at Stanford, California, where I lived for a year, and sort of my wife hated me for this. Now, would you choose the standard or the hybrid version? Right? Frankly, a very relevant decision. It turns out that this car actually exists in both versions. And of course, right, again, no one here at Grantham would consider this to be a surprise. But of course, the way we look at this, we as economists, as decision scientists, as scientists looking at people's behavior, is to come up with some kind of model that says, okay, let's try to figure out how people in fact behave and how we can move them from one way to the other. Well, here's how economists model this kind of behavior. All right? The quote-unquote rational view of choosing your next mode of transport. Right, so you walk into the car dealership, you choose a car based on brand, color, symbols, looks, and so on. You look at gas mileage, today's price per gallon, form an opinion, solve the the perfect conditions, second order conditions, and the like, and essentially do the best possible hyper-rational job of figuring out which car to buy. Now, of course, no one actually believes that this is in fact what's going on, to which economists, of course, have a very good answer. No, 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 we don't think you do this, but on average, we all behave that way. And once again, there are two reactions to this. One is to basically look at this and laugh and sort of say, look, economists, seriously, that's what you believe? You call yourself social scientists. That's not how society behaves. That's not how you as the economist behave when you walk into a car dealership. Or the other version, of course, is to then say, okay, well, let's test whether people actually behave this way. And I'm happy to say, of course, that two economists have done just that. Hunt Alcott, Steve Rosny, who looked at 1.5 million car purchasing decisions Apologies for the US centrism here. This is once again a paper studying how the average American household, right, who no one would accuse of including climate beliefs strongly in their personal decision making on a daily basis, nor in some ways you would say should they. Now, how does the average household, the average human being, behave when you measure their behavior in the car dealership? And basically the thought experiment is, well, what if you increase the price of gasoline, gas taxes, by $1? Works for £1 as well, right? You buy one currency, one unit of currency. What happens? Well, for every $1 in fuel savings later, for the economists in the room, right, properly discounted, net present value, and so on, so everything is done correctly here. For every $1 in fuel savings today, looking over the lifetime of the car, the average American car buyer is willing to put down 76 cents. Or to avoid false accuracy, let's say $0.75 of a buck. Now, okay, of course, right, it means it's not $1, right? The rational human being would put down $1 today to get $1 back, otherwise you leave money on the street. Fine. I would say this is good enough. 75%, $0.75 of the way to where you need to be. Or in other words, we could do a lot worse of focusing on the standard old boring zombie economic description of how we behave and essentially say, let's at the very least get that one right. Yes, to get to the other 25%, let's do sort of all the other fancy stuff, right? Behavioral economics, whatever it might be, that basically gets us all the way along the way. Or for that matter, let's use all of this knowledge to get to the 75 cents in the first place, right? i.e. put the policy in place that gets us there in the first place. But really what this is saying, of course, is that at the end of the day, yes, the standard answer seems to work pretty well, right? There's one law we have in economics, law of demand. Technically the law of compensated demand, but still, law of demand, right? Price goes up, demand goes down, works every time. Or at least it certainly doesn't fail for something as fundamental and as basic as CO2. Price goes up, demand goes down. Day in and day out. And American car buyers have proven, at least in the sample between 1999 and 2008, to behave exactly that way. Here's a number I'll leave you with. Forget the $40, or where we need to be for that matter. Anyone here from Sweden? Or originally Swedish? It works better with an actual Swede in the room, but turns out actually my former boss is from Sweden, and he sort of liked to tell this story, saying, well, guess what the average Swede talks about over the dinner table? Here's what they don't talk about. They don't talk about the fact that the price of CO2 in Sweden today is greater than $150 per ton, or greater than 100 pounds per ton of CO2. It just happens to be the case, and largely as a result, and of course it goes both ways, right? You don't know which came first. Obviously the two were self-reinforcing, but while the price is $150 per ton of CO2, greater than that, the Swedish heating sector, electricity sector is largely decarbonized. Once again, law of demand. It works every single time. $150 per ton. And no, the average Swede does not talk about a $150 per ton price on CO2 at the dinner table, right? They talk about their wives and girlfriends and husbands and boyfriends and how their lives went. And yes, they just happen to lead lives that, when it comes to the electricity sector, when it comes to the heating sector, the sectors covered by this price on CO2 just happen to be essentially decarbonized. Now, of course, this is Scandinavia, right? They're always doing the right thing, and if it's not in their best interest, handing out Nobel Prizes left and right and all this thing. Still. And of course, right, the Swedes aren't necessarily coming off as the best example here of anyone because, well, Volvo happens to be producing cars, and the transport sector is in fact not fully covered by this price. So when you pump a liter of gasoline at the pump, no, you're not paying $150 per ton of CO2. Of course, the gas tax, petrol tax is also a lot higher than it is, at least in the States. But still, when it comes to the heating and the electric sector, you look at $150 and life goes on. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got plenty of time for questions. I suggest that we try to take 2 or 3 together and then give Gernot an opportunity to answer them. There's also at least one microphone roving around the room. So if you do have a question, can you please wait until we bring the microphone to you? Let me take a first round of questions then. So I have a gentleman down here at the front.
Jeff Beacon, the Pollution Tax Association. Thank you for an excellent performance. It's really good. Does it worry you that the climate models that were used in IPCC AR5, the CMIP5 models, had several feedbacks missing, like forest fires, melting tundra, even this clathrate story in the East Siberian Sea, and that things may be considerably worse than you're talking about. And the other comment is that even $150 a tonne on gasoline is just putting petrol prices up by, that's what we call it here,
yep.
up by about 6%. And doesn't really, if you're thinking of putting new people in cities, you're getting rid of about 100 tonnes of carbon dioxide to build the things with current technology.
Yep.
And even at $150 a tonne, that's only 15 grand, when a new apartment in the city, plus the office place and all the rest, is, 300,000 or 400,000, much more. And so there's lots of things you've missed out. Isn't it far worse than you say? And could you go over your argument again, putting these extras in?
So we perhaps take one further question if there is one.
An uplifting one, ideally.
Okay, so I've got. Well, I'll take a gentleman over here first, and then we'll go back over there. In the interest of fairness to both sides of the room.
Thanks, Simon. I'm Paul Eakins from University College London. Thanks, Gernot. Firstly, climate change is an insurance problem. I think I heard you say that, and I've found that a very helpful thought, but I've actually come to the conclusion it's a wrong thought, in the sense that we normally insure in order to restore the status quo ante once things go wrong, whereas with climate change we're installing smoke alarms and sprinkler systems rather than buying insurance. It's a risk reduction policy. I'd just like you to comment on that and see how that might change the narrative. Number 2, Naomi Klein's written a book recently called This Changes Everything, and this has been featured in the front page of The Guardian last weekend, you may know. I actually think that's wrong too, and I'd like you to comment on that. I think that's a seriously scary message for people. And in fact, Sweden shows that it doesn't change everything. $150 a tonne. Sweden's been living with that for some years. You go to Sweden, as you say,
life goes on.
They barely notice it, but the carbon intensity of their economy goes down, and they're one of the most carbon unintensive economies in Europe. Third one is a little more complicated and really important, I think. I shared a platform the other day with a man called Peter Lilly, who is a UK Member of Parliament, who rejoices in the fact that he was one of 5 UK members of Parliament to vote against the Climate Change Act. He's moved a long way in his perceptions of climate change, in the sense that he doesn't deny it anymore. And what he does do is talk about the cost-benefit analysis, where I'm kind of feeling on slightly safer ground there.
Yep.
And he did the remarkable feat of quoting Nick Stern's numbers from the Stern Review and coming to precisely the opposite conclusion to Nick Stern, which was interesting And I just wonder, you know, your book is titled Economics and Consequences of Climate Change. I sense that that is really where this debate now is, which is obviously a good place for it to be as far as Grantham is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering how close you think we are really to getting to the bottom of the economic consequences of climate change, in the way that this gentleman over here was talking about.
Yep.
You know, some of the fat tails out there that is beyond the 6%, the 6 degrees that you're talking about, and is still non-negligible. Can you just tell me how the research is going to actually unpack some of that stuff? Because it seems to me that that's going to be a very important part of the argument.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let me give you a chance to respond to those first
5
two,
questions so far, yes.
I'll come back to you next time.
Okay, thank you. So, do IPCC models include all feedback loops? No, absolutely not. Let me give you sort of a very simple story about this. 6 years ago by now, the prior IPCC assessment report basically ignored sea level rise for every other reason other than what's called thermal expansion, i.e., yes, warmer water takes up more space. You can experiment with that with your kids at home. That was included. The sort of little known fact that ice sheets melt when temperatures get warmer, and that when ice that's previously on land melts actually raises sea levels, was in fact not included. Now, not because climate scientists thought that that's not happening, right? Call it a known unknown, right? Everyone knows that that's what's going on, but the range of uncertainty is just so large that no one could agree on a single number, and frankly, no one should agree on a single number on that particular point because the uncertainty is so large. So, yeah, it was mentioned in a footnote, several footnotes, in this monster of the IPCC report. Now, the final number that everyone quotes, of course, the one single number of by how much will sea level rise as temperatures increase, only included the thermal expansion aspect, not ice sheets melting. It's a minor problem if you think about it. Right now, it turns out that we have fixed. Scientists, I'm not the climate scientist here as part of this conversation, but climate scientists, in fact, have fixed that from the 2007 report to the 2013 report. Now, there are plenty of other feedback loops that are, in fact, excluded. I'm not sure that we have the full list in our book. There's a very, I can tell you, I think it's a page and a half, the endnote itself, just on that topic. We'd like to summarize it in English up front, but the endnote is quite substantive and includes many of these things left out. And yes, of course, right, most everything we leave out, both the known unknowns and then, of course, the unknown unknowns go in one and only one direction. It makes things even worse than we thought, right? What we know is bad. What we don't know is potentially much worse, right? That's one. Now, transport, $150 per ton of CO2 only raises petrol prices by 6%. Right? I only know the dollar number, but $150 per ton of CO2 raises the cost of a gallon of gasoline. I don't think in liters, we think in gallons. Or at least when I pull out my US passport, when I pull out my Austrian passport. I'm closer to what you would think of here, but yes, it's a small number, right? Is that going to revolutionize the transport sector? No, right? Google working on the self-driving car and Tesla on the electric vehicle and them sort of combining forces, or Apple for that matter getting in the game, probably has a lot more potential to do good here than a simple price on CO2 on the transport sector itself. I'm completely with you. Right now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be pricing CO2 in the first place. Of course we should. We also shouldn't be under the illusion that it is in fact $150 or $40 for that matter, and getting out of the way, and that we'll do it for everything and everyone. No, it won't. But as the Swedish example shows, heating sector or industry for that matter, right, where you actually have fairly rational decisions being made by people who are being paid to be rational every step along the way. Sure, right, large companies reacting to the price. You and I individually, again, I can exclude myself from this, I don't have a license, but if you actually did make the car purchasing decision, then yes, absolutely, right? Now, right, me not having a license, I'm not saying that that's the answer, of course, it's not, right? But of course, the true solution may well be something closer to that. Guess how I make my decision where I live? Not based on the price of petrol or the petroleum tax, for that matter. I make it based on, well, it looks like I have to walk to work. Can't really do anything else. Or for that matter, take the subway or the bike, or I tend to run to work in the morning. No, it's not that long, but still. Maybe it is in fact these kinds of decisions, or a decision that ought to conclude these kinds of factors. And yes, I'm pretty happy by the fact that my run in the morning is about 10 minutes, and I usually take a conference call on my way back, and I walk home 45 minutes, and it's a pretty productive 45 minutes, or at least a productive conference call as far as these items usually go on your agenda. So yes, right, it takes more than just the price on CO2, especially when it comes to the transport sector. Your 3 questions, every single one very apt, or the first one especially, insurance versus risk management, or a different frame. In many ways, insurance is in fact the shortcut for what I would properly describe as in fact a risk management problem. Right? Now, you could take the insurance analogy all the way and essentially say, well, what is the insurance premium? It's the price per ton of CO2 here. Now, the insurance doesn't make you whole. There's still plenty of nasty side effects even when we price CO2. Right? But the insurance thinking here is in fact, okay, how do we remove the problem in the first place? Now, another way of thinking of it, of course, is in fact precisely as a risk management problem. Right? It comes in many ways out to the same thing. It's not the average that counts, it's the extremes. And then you look at it as a risk management problem, right? We have to basically draw a bright red line and say we don't cross that threshold. So what are the implications for the price on CO2 today in order to avoid crossing the threshold? Right? There'll always be a small chance that something catastrophic can in fact happen at any moment. Right? Quantum physics tells us there's a tiny chance that our planet will sort of suddenly be thrown off its current course and we end up in somewhere else in space. Now, we shouldn't be worrying about that necessarily, right? Strangelets, right? As an example, right? We shouldn't be worrying about that on a daily basis, right? There's a tiny, tiny chance that running CERN would in fact possibly produce something like this. Well, what is theoretically possible is in fact up for debate, and the absolutely upper limit is something like 0. many, many, many zeros, and then a 1% chance of it in fact happening. Here we're looking at a 10% chance. That is a risk management problem, and it's one we ought to be taking seriously. Naomi Klein. She basically says we ought to stick it to the man. That is her solution to climate change. I would say don't stick it to the man, stick it to CO2. Or in other words, she is half right. She is half right about the fact that this is a very, very big problem. And I can tell you her name does in fact show up in the epilogue to the book, and basically in this context, right? Don't stick it to the man like she would propose, stick it to CO2. We know the enemy here, right? Economists have a very hard time picking winners. You can sure as hell identify the loser here. And once again, of course, it's greenhouse gas pollution. So, no, we don't need to revamp the way we live. Look at the Swedes. No, we don't have to throw out capitalism entirely. Look at the Swedes. Or look at the EU, European emissions trading system for that matter, or sort of plenty of other examples of places that have policies in place and life goes on despite a positive price on CO2. So, right, if in many ways, right, if that's your thing, you basically keep writing books about how we ought to revamp the system, and now climate is your latest excuse to be writing a book about revamping the system. Feel free to take the cover of The Guardian and make your argument. Now, it would be great to in fact have a debate that says in the end, yes, we can all agree that CO2 is the enemy. It's not in fact about revamping the system overall. It's about pricing CO2 and then frankly getting out of the way, except for the transport sector, maybe. And sorry?
And beef.
and beef. I'm vegetarian, but yes. But that's exactly, right? This is exactly the point. Right, on the transport side, on the meat consumption side, let's say, it may well take much, much more than the simple price on CO2 and getting out of the way. But for much of anything else, for the vast majority of CO2 pollution, at least some like 60–70% if you add everything up other than transport, it's the price on CO2, i.e. stick it to CO2. Don't do what Klein proposes and stick it to the man. Your last question, right, so I shouldn't say I'm glad to hear, but in some sense, it's good to see, let me put it this way, that it's not just the US that is dealing with people like that, who basically are out there trying to make a name for themselves by, let's say, our famous senator bringing a snowball to the floor of the Senate and saying, I disprove climate change because look at the picture of my kids building an igloo at home, or look at this snowball, I found it outside on my way to work this morning. So Senator Inhofe, a duly elected senator in the US Senate, who literally a couple of weeks ago brought a snowball onto the floor of the US Senate and showed that climate change was not real because he has a snowball in his hands. I won't pretend to know what the sort of British version of that character would be up to.
Less extreme.
Less extreme, okay, good. Now, I'm also glad to hear that, frankly, he is essentially saying, okay, it's all about the economics. Let's look at the benefit-cost analysis. Right? He would probably call it the cost-benefit analysis. I would say benefits before costs. Let's call it a benefit-cost analysis when it comes to climate action. But, in fact, the $40 number we are looking at, right, this 25-pound number, is a result of one of these benefit-cost analyses. And there are many, many, many researchers here at the LSE, at Grantham especially, who would criticize that number as too low, falsely accurate, and they're right to do so. I would say when it comes to guiding public policy, right, we could do a lot worse than look at that $40 or any positive number, frankly, that is greater than $10, let's say, at this point, and say, at the very least, let's do what is necessary to get the price of CO2 to that level. So I'm pretty sure, right, no matter what benefit-cost analysis he looks at, and I'm sure he can take Lord Stern's results out of context and disprove everything that anyone has ever seriously argued around climate change. But at the end of the day, the most conservative, lowercase conservative, benefit-cost analyses out there essentially show that at the very least it is 25 pounds per ton of CO2, $40 per ton of CO2 that we ought to be pricing CO2 in order to have any semblance of incorporating the full external costs here.
Okay, let's take a few more questions. I owe this gentleman the opportunity to ask his question first because he had his hand up last time, and then I'll come over here.
Thank you very much. Do I have to press anything here or just talk into it?
I think you can just talk into it.
Julian
for all I know.
is my name. I have been a reporter over the years dealing quite a bit with energy and climate change. I agree with you totally about the numbers that are published on, Antarctic ice and sea level rise. It doesn't take very much reading, but it's not getting into the textbooks, I suspect, to find that actually, we could be in for a lot more than a metre of sea level rise by 2100. And there's some very respectable people, with worries in that regard. On the question of CO2 emissions and CO2 equivalent, which you did mention, I suppose the big worry must be, not least in the USA, about fugitive methane emissions. I was trying to look into this a year or so ago, and you could take your pick of studies. How big are the fugitive methane emissions from shale gas sites? You could take an industry study which came out with about, you lose 1% of the gas. You could turn to an Ivy League university and get a figure of anywhere from 3 to 5% or bigger. And then there was a study which I think your body was associated with, which was a lot lower and nearer the industry study. But then I found that your study appeared to have also been the one that your name was associated with, not your personal name,
EDF.
EDF, had been funded by companies involved in this whole oil and gas development. And I wondered whether that, whether you thought that had been a mistake, if that was the case, whether you said whether you were so desperate for money that they had to take the funding from the industry, and whether any lessons there really.
Okay, so there's one question. If you could bring the microphone up to the back on the left.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. My name is Gernot Wagner. I just have a question about what's your favourite method for getting the price of carbon? Because that's quite controversial. There's different ways of doing it. I just wanted to hear.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one more question, which is a gentleman in the middle at the back there.
You flatter me by calling me a gentleman.
Deny all knowledge of this gentleman.
Bob Ward. One of the things that Nick Stern does these days is he won't talk about climate change in terms of cost-benefit analysis because economists tend to do it in such a narrow way that it leaves all the important risks out. And he talks about risk management. Not only because the numbers you come up with don't convey the scale. So you could talk about the Second World War in terms of its impact on global GDP, but it wouldn't tell you anything about what had happened during the war. It wouldn't convey the full horror of it. So I'm wondering whether it's time that the economists, similarly all around the world, talked about the rather limited use of cost-benefit analysis. I wanted to come back to the comment Paul made. Peter Lilly misrepresents routinely the numbers from the Stern Review in a way that takes them literal and ignores the fact that there's a very clear health warning on that chapter about economic analysis saying these don't capture the full scale of the impacts that you'd expect to see. So I think that there's a real issue here that the economists are contributing to the problem by continuing to suggest that cost-benefit analysis is an appropriate way of assessing this problem in the first place.
Right, so we've got three questions there. I've learned the error of my ways, so I'm going to sit down while you answer those and get back up for the next one.
I'll try to be brief. So, absolutely on the sea level rise. Right? Industry-funded study, so I can tell you the one thing, many things EDF does well, but one thing in particular, we don't in fact take money from companies, except for some very, very limited exceptions. This wasn't one of them. Now, sort of just the broader picture of methane, fugitive methane emissions, right, is an enormous problem. Right? So in the US, we are looking at a decrease in overall greenhouse gas emissions since 2005, and an amazing decrease, right? Frankly, despite the lack of any policy, well, most of it was because of a dramatic shift from coal to natural gas. Of course, that shift from coal to natural gas only really has climate benefits when you get methane leakage under control. An enormous problem, a lot of things that have to happen policy-wise to rein in fugitive methane emissions. And it won't surprise you to hear that EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, is in fact strongly advocating for precisely that. Carbon tax versus, or my favorite instrument. You didn't necessarily say tax versus anything else, but of course that's implied in many ways. And maybe also sort of, in some sense, let me conflate that with your question, Bob, on should we be talking about benefit cost analysis versus essentially risk management, and sort of say, look, this is an enormous effort akin to the mobilization for World War II, let's say, from the Allied forces. And no one in their right mind would say, here's the benefit cost analysis, what was it worth to build that tank? Right? Or maybe sort of even a more extreme example, the abolition movement, right? So I'm sure you can, or actually, in fact, I have done that somewhere in an endnote here, or actually mentioned in the book, when you look at sort of the history of looking at abolition movement, looking at sort of the end of slavery, right? There were, in fact, benefit cost analyses done that said, okay, here's the costs, here's the benefits, should we do it? Or women's suffrage, right? Or abolishing child labor is a fantastic example along these lines. Right? So there are these 12-year-old hands that are fantastic in making pottery. So there are costs to abolishing child labor because we won't have the same vase anymore if we ban 12-year-olds from making vases for us. Right? Now, no one in their right mind would nowadays, or very, very soon after that debate, then say, okay, let's have a debate, right? There's a policy debate here. Should we be sort of taxing or limiting the amount somehow of child labor used? And let's have a benefit cost analysis that figures out what to do, right? Not at all, right? It is solidly a moral argument, definitely today, and very, very soon after these sort of in many ways misguided benefit cost debates, it turned into a moral argument. And no one in their right mind would look at child labor as a benefit cost issue, right? Should we sort of do it again, right? So he was like 8 or 9 months in this picture, but now he's 4, right? Perfect little hands to sort of make pottery for the rest of us. No, of course not, right? Now, what does that mean when it comes to instrument choice, let's say, or for that matter, how to talk about climate change? Well, I started this by looking at sort of the US calculation of the sort of this $40 number, right? Well, it turns out that in Washington, in many ways what we have at the moment to be doing serious climate policy in the US on the federal level is the Clean Air Act of 1970. Applied now due to a Supreme Court decision saying, yes, CO2 is in fact an air pollutant. Let's apply the Clean Air Act for very, very good reasons. And now you are left with the procedural mandate to do a benefit cost analysis. And we would love to, right? I wrote a whole book. I would like to think about the fact that we should move beyond benefit cost analysis and look at climate as a risk management problem. Now, at the end of the day, right, if Cass Sunstein asks you for the number to plug into the benefit cost analysis, and there are lots of rules being passed that do a lot of good to maximize social well-being by putting a positive price on CO2 in administrative rulemaking, you ought to, in fact, have a number. So would it be helpful to shift the debate, A, from $40 or from any benefit cost analysis to risk management on the one hand, and then from risk management to saying CO2 really is a moral issue, something that should not be done. Right? Like, I would love for sort of like throw out the economists, bring in sort of the priests, rabbis, non-denominational ethicists, and at the end of the day, basically make a case eventually that says, right, CO2 pollution ought to go the way of child labor. Fantastic. Let's take the moral high ground. But in order to take the moral high ground, there needs to be higher ground to go to in the first place. And in many ways, in order to do this today at a practical level, by sticking it to CO2, not sticking it to demand, it is in fact economics that is central to the message. And in many ways, in many cases, on the one hand is the benefit cost analysis, that right, sort of bread and butter, we have the $40 or maybe $100 or whatever it might be, plug it in, have your policy, and do the right thing as a result, pricing CO2 either implicitly or explicitly. Or for that matter, absolutely, let's try in many ways, right, moving beyond the administrative procedural mandate for benefit cost analysis and saying, okay, how should we really be talking about this as economists, as a profession? And yes, once again, I would like to point you to a book here that basically tries to do exactly that. We take the $40 as a starting point. We take Bill Nordhaus's model, DICE model, and right, Richard Toll, Lantoff, Chris Hope, and so on, these models as the starting point, and say, yes, there is a $40 number here that's floating around in the background because that's what these 12 government agencies in the US has given us by running these models. But at the end of the day, what really matters is, in fact, the fat tail, the unknown unknowns, the black swans, however you call them. It's the risk management that matters at the end of the day. And in order to take that seriously, yes, there's the benefit cost analysis to be done, but really we ought to be changing the conversation away from one single number, even a range of numbers, to the risk management thinking that, frankly, right, so financial industry, anyone is But anyone who's ever thought about risk would say, of course, climate change is a risk management issue. There's so many known unknowns and unknown unknowns that at the end of the day, really what we ought to do is figure out how to slim the tails, get rid of the fat tails, or somehow figure out how to make sure that these unknown unknowns don't come back to hurt us. It's risk management. It is not a single number that we can plug in here.
Okay, well, I promised I would finish a round now, but let me give the opportunity for one or two last quick questions, if you have them. So, one here.
Hi, my name is Lucy. How can financial models account for the needs of developing countries, so allowing economic development in the face of the fact that they are already realising the problems of climate change where we are now and how they can develop a green economy? And also, how can it account for other environmental problems that are incredibly significant, like nitrate and phosphate, like rare earth minerals, all these environmental problems that exist outside of carbon and carbon accounting mechanisms?
Okay, thank you. I'll perhaps take one last question if anyone has one. Okay, well, just right behind you there.
It seems to me that a large proportion of the problems in the climate change debate stem from a poor public understanding of risk and uncertainty. So do you have any ideas about how we go about addressing that?
Thank you. I'll ask a couple of questions for you, Gernot.
Buying the book, I assume, is not the full, complete answer. Okay, so excellent questions. There are books to be written, and many books that already exist on precisely the inequality, right? Developing country aspects of growth versus the environment, let's put it that way. Growth versus climate. Huge topic. Let me not try to brush over the question, but sort of essentially say that in the very standard treatment, how economists look at the problem, in very limited ways, frankly, and it ignores many other aspects of it, mainly because we do in fact look at averages, not at ranges of implications of a price on CO2, for example. Really what income inequality does, makes the case for mitigation even stronger. Right? Newsflash, it is not the rich who will suffer the most. Right? You will buy a second air conditioner and move to higher ground. It's the poor. Right? You either essentially adapt, that's what the rich do, or you suffer. So to minimize suffering means even more mitigation. Now, of course, there is now a trade-off here in many ways. And frankly, if anyone is good at dealing with these trade-offs, it is the economists on the one hand, on the other hand. One thing we're very, very good at. And yes, right, including inequality, including that precise trade-off into our calculations, in fact, in many ways, in most instances, and of course there's plenty more complications to go into, would in fact say, okay, in the risk management frame especially, we ought to mitigate risk, to those who are most vulnerable, and in order to mitigate risk to those who are most vulnerable, we need to increase the price on CO2 even further. Now there's also, of course, the flip side of this, and frankly the hopeful story in many ways. Right? India has $1 per ton tax on coal, CO2 coal, still. $500 million in revenues per year from that tax, and some of it, not all of it, is in fact being spent on renewable energy subsidies for the right things, the clean and the lean. China is experimenting with 7 regional cap and trade systems. Brazil has a national climate target, and in fact has decreased emissions from deforestation quite dramatically within 3 to 5 years. Right? So there are plenty of positive examples, especially in many ways, at least from a US perspective, in the developing world, who in fact, right, for many, many very good reasons, say, well, we're the most vulnerable. You should also, in some sense, take the moral high ground here and, in fact, take the right steps. Now, other environmental problems other than CO2, in some sense, let me hide behind the fact that global warming is a big enough issue. Let's solve this, and that doesn't mean we should not ignore nitrous emissions, phosphates, and everything else that are a huge issue. And frankly, in many ways, there's once again trade-offs here as well. Now, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To an economist who says, well, the externalities, let's price them. The same that applies to CO2 also applies to phosphates, also applies to many other aspects. Right? Now we can have the debate, what is the right instrument to tackle phosphates? Is it precisely a price? Is it a more targeted intervention? Is it a cap-and-trade system, a limit on phosphates overall, or whatever it might be? But at the end of the day, the solution is in fact pretty much exactly the same. There's an externality. In this case, it's not the climate externality, it is another environmental externality. Let's do something about that. Right? Plastic bags. Right? They have negative effects. Now, in some sense, one answer is let's ban them, right? That's not the right economic answer in many ways, because that means we put an infinite cost on each plastic bag, an infinite price on each plastic bag. Let's price them, right? Ireland priced them, 15 euro cents initially, plastic bag use went down by 90% within a year. Once again, law of demand happens to work every single time. And in this case too, whether it's climate or another environmental problem. Now, risk versus uncertainty. I would, in fact, in many ways simply say one thing here. When you talk about uncertainty, and I realize that to an economist who studied 19 risk versus 19 uncertainty, it is clear that uncertainty is technically worse than risk. In reality, to the rest of us, to everybody else, when you hear the word uncertainty, it means, I'm not so sure, let's wait and see. When you hear risk, you hear, let's mitigate. Everyone understands what risk is. So, frankly, we could do a lot worse as economists, or as anyone talking about what has to happen on climate change, by yes, acknowledging the fact that we've all understood Frank Knight's University of Chicago 1923 dissertation. And yes, there's an expansive endnote in the book that talks about how we, Martin Weitzman and I, as co-authors of this book, get the fact that uncertainty is worth the risk. I can tell you when it comes to actually writing the main text, we don't brush over it, but we very clearly say that really what we taught to talk about is risk, not uncertainty. Uncertainty means wait and see. Risk means mitigate.
Okay. Well, that's all we've got time for, everyone. Let me first thank you for coming. Also remind you that there's book signing now in here for those of you who left a copy of the book. They're available to buy. And finally, please join me in thanking very much Gernot for coming and giving us this excellent public lecture.